April 7th, 1945. Dawn had barely broken over the East China Sea when Lieutenant Junior Grade Jack Lawler felt his hands tighten around the control column of his TBM Avenger torpedo bomber. Through the salt-streaked plexiglass of his cockpit, he could see the silhouette that would define the rest of his life, assuming he had a rest of his life after the next 10 minutes. The Japanese battleship Yamato was the largest, most heavily armed warship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel, bristling with 9 18-inch naval rifles that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle over 25 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches of hardened steel, thick enough that conventional bombs simply bounced off. She had survived 2 years of American air attacks, shrugged off torpedo hits that would have sunk lesser ships, and her crew of 2,700 men believed she was unsinkable. What they didn't know was that Lawler and his squadron mates were about to prove them catastrophically wrong, using a technique so dangerous that Navy doctrine had explicitly forbidden it. The attack altitude would be 50 feet, not 500, not 200, 50 feet above the water, close enough to see individual rivets on the battleship's hull, close enough to make eye contact with Japanese sailors manning anti-aircraft guns before those guns could depress low enough to track you. The mathematics of this attack defied every principle of survival. A battleship like Yamato carried over 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. At normal torpedo attack, altitude of 150 to 200 feet, those guns would create an interlocking field of fire that made survival improbable. But at 50 feet, flying barely above the wave tops, something strange happened. Most of those guns couldn't aim low enough. Their designers had never imagined aircraft would attack from angles that steep, that close, that insane. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The gamble was brutal in its simplicity. Get below the gun depression angles, close to point-blank range before releasing your torpedo, and pray that the battleship's own superstructure would block enough anti-aircraft fire to give you a chance. The alternative was to attack from conventional altitude and get shredded by every gun on the ship before you ever got close enough to drop your weapon. Lawler had chosen the insane option, and he wasn't alone. The story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy's mightiest warship met its end begins not with that morning's attack, but with a strategic decision made in desperation 6 days earlier. By April 1945, Japan was losing the war in every measurable way. American forces had captured Iwo Jima, the Philippines were lost. Okinawa, barely 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, was under massive American amphibious assault. The Japanese Navy, once the most powerful in the Pacific, had been reduced to a shadow fleet. Most of its carriers were gone, sunk in the catastrophic defeats at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Fuel oil was critically short, trained pilots were even scarcer. But Japan still had Yamato, and her sister ship, Musashi, sunk the previous October, had taken 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally going down. If Yamato could reach Okinawa, if she could beach herself on the invasion beaches and use her massive guns as a fortified artillery platform, she could slaughter American troops and landing craft by the thousands. The plan was called Operation Tengo, meaning Heaven Number 1. The name was aspirational because everyone involved knew the operation was really a one-way suicide mission. Yamato would sail from Japan to Okinawa with an escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was simple in the way that doomed plans are always simple. Sail to Okinawa at maximum speed, beach the ship, and use her as an unsinkable fortress until either the Americans were driven off or Yamato's ammunition ran out. The crew would then abandon ship and fight as infantry. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the operation, knew it was suicide. He argued against it. He pointed out that American carrier aircraft controlled the skies around Okinawa. Yamato would never make it close enough to be useful. She would be spotted, tracked, and swarmed by hundreds of aircraft long before reaching the invasion beaches. His superiors acknowledged this was likely. They ordered him to sail anyway. The mission wasn't really about military effectiveness. It was about honor, about demonstrating that the Imperial Navy would fight to the death rather than surrender. Yamato's death was the point. Ito assembled his crew on the morning of April 6th and told them the truth. This was a one-way mission. They would almost certainly die. Any man who wanted to leave could do so without shame. Every single man stayed aboard. 2,700 sailors chose certain death over the possibility of abandoning their comrades and their ship. At 2:30 in the afternoon on April 6th, Yamato and her escorts departed from Tokuyama in the Inland Sea and headed southwest toward Okinawa, approximately 350 nautical miles away. The weather was overcast, which gave Ito some hope that they might avoid detection long enough to get close to their target. That hope lasted exactly 4 hours. At 6:15 that evening, the American submarines Threadfin and Hackleback spotted Yamato's task force and immediately radioed contact reports. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet off Okinawa, received the reports within minutes. He knew exactly what Yamato was attempting, and he had no intention of letting a 72,000-ton battleship anywhere near his invasion beaches. Spruance immediately ordered Task Force 58 to prepare a massive airstrike. Task Force 58 was the fast carrier task force, the primary offensive striking arm of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In April 1945, it consisted of 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, over 1,000 aircraft, and some of the most experienced naval aviators in history. These were men who had fought their way across the Pacific, who had learned their craft in the brutal school of carrier warfare against an enemy that gave no quarter. The plan that emerged that night was overwhelming in its scope. Nearly 400 aircraft would launch at first light on April 7th. Fighters would establish air superiority and suppress anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers would attack from high altitude, targeting the superstructure and fire control systems. And torpedo bombers, flying TBM Avengers, would hit below the waterline with the only weapons that could actually sink a ship as massive as Yamato. Among the pilots receiving their briefings that night was Jack Lawler of Torpedo Squadron 14, flying from the carrier USS Wasp. Lawler was 23 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, and he had been flying combat missions for 8 months. He'd attacked Japanese ships before, smaller vessels that died quickly when torpedoes struck their hulls. But Yamato was different. Every pilot in the ready room knew the battleship's reputation. They'd heard about Musashi taking 19 torpedoes before sinking. The question wasn't whether they could hit Yamato. The question was whether hitting her would even matter. The briefing officer laid out the tactical situation with brutal honesty. Yamato's anti-aircraft armament was formidable. She carried 24 5-inch guns in 12 twin mounts, 130 twin 25mm machine cannon, and 25mm triple mounts. At conventional attack altitude, the 5-inch guns would tear them apart before they got close. The solution, the briefing officer said, was to go in low, very low, below 100 feet if possible. What the briefing officer didn't say, what didn't need to be said, was that flying that low over open ocean in combat conditions with a 2,000-pound torpedo hanging under your aircraft was asking pilots to thread a needle while someone shot at them. The margin for error was measured in feet. Fly too high and the anti-aircraft guns would kill you. Fly too low and you'd hit the water, and at 250 miles per hour, hitting water was the same as hitting concrete. Lawler listened to the briefing and made a decision that he wouldn't share with anyone until after the mission was over. If 100 feet was good, 50 feet would be better, and if 50 feet got him close enough, he'd go lower still. The logic was simple, even if the execution would be anything but. Every foot lower he flew was another gun that couldn't depress enough to track him. Every second closer he got before releasing his torpedo was one less second for the weapon to be evaded or shot out of the water. He'd done the math in his head dozens of times. A torpedo dropped from 150 feet at 250 miles per hour would enter the water roughly 1,200 yards from the target. That gave a battleship's captain nearly 30 seconds to maneuver, to turn the ship and present a narrower target profile, or to simply accelerate out of the torpedo's path. But if you got to within 500 yards, 300 yards, even closer, the torpedo would strike before the battleship could react. The enemy would have no time to evade. But getting that close meant flying through what amounted to a tunnel of tracer fire with walls made of exploding shells. April 7th dawned grey and overcast. The ceiling was low, visibility was poor, and the sea was running heavy swells that made low-altitude flying even more dangerous. For the pilots preparing to launch, the weather was both curse and blessing. It would make navigation harder, formation flying more difficult, and increase the risk of controlled flight into water. But it would also provide concealment, making it harder for Japanese radar and lookouts to spot them until they were close. The first wave launched at 10 o'clock that morning. Fighters went first. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, whose job was to shoot down any Japanese aircraft that might interfere and to strafe Yamato's anti-aircraft positions. Then came the dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses and Curtiss SB-2 Sea Helldivers, carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Finally, the torpedo bombers, TBM Avengers, each carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo. Lawler's Avenger lifted off from Wasp's deck at 10:15, the torpedo's weight making the aircraft feel sluggish and heavy. He formed up with his squadron, mates, and turned southwest toward the last reported position of Yamato's task force. The flight would take just over an hour, giving him plenty of time to think about what he was about to attempt. The TBM Avenger was a remarkable aircraft, vastly superior to the TBD Devastator that had been slaughtered at Midway 3 years earlier. It was faster, with a top speed of 275 miles per hour. It was tougher, with armor plate protecting the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode from a single bullet hit. And it carried a crew of 3, pilot, turret gunner, and radio man, giving it defensive firepower that made attacking it a dangerous proposition even for enemy fighters. But no amount of armor or defensive guns could protect you from a direct hit by a 5-inch anti-aircraft shell. And Yamato had 24 of those guns, each capable of firing 15 rounds per minute, each shell weighing 55 pounds and detonating with enough force to vaporize an aircraft. The only defense was speed, surprise, and flying so low that the guns couldn't track you. At 11:20, the formation descended through the cloud cover and spotted the Japanese task force below. Even from 10,000 feet, Yamato was unmistakable. She was enormous, her pagoda-style superstructure rising 70 feet above her main deck, her triple turrets housing the 18-inch guns that defined her as the ultimate expression of battleship design. The light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers surrounded her, but they were insignificant compared to the battle wagon at the center. American fighters were already swarming over the formation, strafing and rocketing the smaller ships. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns were firing continuously, filling the sky with black bursts and streams of tracer fire. The dive bombers began their attacks, rolling into near-vertical dives from 10,000 feet and releasing their bombs at 2,000 feet before pulling out. Some bombs hit, but Yamato's armor was so thick that the weapons couldn't penetrate to vital spaces. They damaged her superstructure, knocked out some anti-aircraft mounts, started fires, but they didn't slow her down. Then it was time for the torpedo bombers. Lawler's squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert McBroom, took his flight down to 150 feet and began his attack run from Yamato's port quarter. This was standard doctrine, approaching from the stern quarter at an angle that presented the longest possible target profile and gave the torpedo the best chance of hitting. Lawler watched McBroom's flight go in. He saw the anti-aircraft fire intensify as the Avengers closed the range. 5-inch shells burst around them in black clouds. Lighter 25mm tracers streamed up in glowing arcs. One Avenger took a direct hit and exploded in mid-air, the fireball so intense that pieces of burning wreckage fell into the sea trailing smoke. Another was hit in the engine and began trailing fire, the pilot fighting to maintain control long enough to drop his torpedo before ditching. McBroom's torpedo hit Yamato's port side amidships. Lawler saw the column of water thrown up by the explosion, but the battleship kept moving, her speed barely affected. The ship was so massive, her hull so heavily compartmented, that a single torpedo wasn't enough. It would take multiple hits, coordinated strikes that overwhelmed the damage control capabilities, to actually sink her. Lawler made his decision in that instant. He broke from the standard approach pattern and took his Avenger down to 50 feet, leveling off just above the wave tops. His turret gunner, aviation radioman second class James Mitchell, keyed his intercom and said something that Lawler would remember for the rest of his life. "Skipper, we're awful low." Lawler's response was 2 words. "I know." At 50 feet above the water, travelling at 250 miles per hour, the world expect time, compressed into a narrow tunnel of vision. Lawler could see individual waves passing beneath his wings. He could taste salt spray in the cockpit. The Avenger shuddered in the turbulent air, and any mistake, any loss of concentration for even a fraction of a second, would send them cartwheeling into the ocean at a speed that would kill everyone instantly. But the gamble was working. The 50-foot altitude put him below the depression angle of Yamato's 5-inch guns. Those weapons were designed to engage aircraft at medium to high altitude and couldn't aim low enough to track a target this close to the water. The lighter 25mm cannon could track him, and they opened fire immediately, streams of tracer rounds arcing toward his aircraft like deadly fireflies. Lawler jinked left, then right, making small corrections that threw off the gunner's aim without gaining altitude. Tracers passed above his canopy, below his wings, so close he could see individual rounds as they streaked past. His windscreen had a simple grease pencil mark that served as his aiming point, and he kept that mark centered on Yamato's waterline as he closed the range. 1,000 yards. The battleship was turning, trying to present a narrower target, but she was so massive that her turn radius was enormous. She couldn't maneuver quickly enough to avoid an attacker already this close. 800 yards. Anti-aircraft fire was so intense that the air itself seemed solid with metal. Something hit his port wing, tearing a ragged hole in the aluminum skin but missing anything vital. Mitchell was firing his turret gun continuously, not at any specific target but just adding to the chaos, making the Japanese gunners flinch, buying fractions of seconds. 500 yards. Lawler could see men on Yamato's deck, could see them pointing at his aircraft, could see the muzzle flashes from the anti-aircraft guns firing directly at him. He was so close now that he was looking up at the battleship's hull, the steel wall rising above him like a cliff. 300 yards. Mitchell screamed something over the intercom that was lost in the roar of the engine and the hammering of anti-aircraft fire. Lawler's world narrowed to 3 things: his airspeed indicator, his altimeter, and the grease pencil mark on his windscreen lined up perfectly on Yamato's waterline. At 200 yards, close enough to see the rust streaks on the battleship's armor belt, Lawler toggled the torpedo release. The Avenger lurched upward as 2,000 pounds of weight dropped away. The Mark 13 torpedo hit the water nose first, dove beneath the surface, and began its run toward the target, its propellers leaving a visible wake of disturbed water pointing directly at Yamato's hull like an accusation. Lawler didn't see the impact. He was hauling back on the control column with both hands, using every bit of the Avenger's power to climb and bank away from the battleship. Anti-aircraft fire followed him, tracers clawing at his aircraft as he clawed for altitude. Something hit his tail section with a metallic bang that he felt through the airframe, but the controls still responded, and the engine was still running. He rolled the Avenger into a hard left turn and gained altitude, Mitchell calling out damage reports over the intercom. Holes in both wings, the tail section, and the rear fuselage, but nothing critical hit. All 3 crew members were alive. The aircraft was still flying. Only then did Lawler look back at Yamato. A massive column of water was subsiding where his torpedo had struck, right at the waterline amidships on the port side. He'd hit her. From 200 yards range, flying at 50 feet above the water, he'd put his torpedo exactly where he'd aimed it. But one torpedo wouldn't be enough. He could see that immediately. Yamato was listing slightly to port now, taking on water from the hit, but she was still underway, still fighting, her anti-aircraft, guns still firing at the waves of American aircraft swarming over her. It would take everything the Americans had to put her down. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The attack on Yamato lasted approximately 2 hours, but for the men involved, time became meaningless. Wave after wave of American aircraft attacked from every direction, high and low, coordinated and chaotic, overwhelming the battleship's defenses through sheer numbers and relentless aggression. Torpedo Squadron 10 from the carrier Intrepid followed Lawler's lead, attacking from 50 feet and even lower. Lieutenant Thomas Stetson brought his Avenger in so low that his propeller was throwing spray, the aircraft literally flying through the mist kicked up by its own passage. He released his torpedo at what he estimated was 150 yards, so close that he had to pull into a hard climbing turn to avoid hitting Yamato's superstructure. Stetson's torpedo struck the port side near the stern, the explosion throwing a geyser of water higher than the battleship's main mast. The hit jammed Yamato's rudder, making it nearly impossible for her to maneuver. She began steaming in a slow, predictable curve, making her an even easier target for the follow-on attacks. Lieutenant Junior Grade Warren McClellan from Torpedo Squadron 82 off the carrier Bennington attacked from the starboard side, weaving through anti-aircraft fire so intense that he later described it as flying through a solid wall of metal. His torpedo hit just forward of the bridge, the explosion buckling deck plates and flooding forward compartments. The cumulative effect of multiple torpedo hits was beginning to show. Yamato was listing progressively to port as water flooded her compartments faster than her pumps could handle. Her speed dropped from 27 knots to 22, then to 18. The list made it increasingly difficult for her anti-aircraft gunners to track targets, as their mounts were designed to operate on a level deck. Commander Frederick Bakutis, leading the air group from the carrier Intrepid, coordinated what would become the decisive series of attacks. He recognized that Yamato was already mortally wounded but still fighting, and that the key to finishing her quickly was to concentrate all remaining torpedoes on one side of the ship. If they could overwhelm the port side, where she was already listing, they could capsize her through sheer volume of flooding. Bakutis radioed his torpedo squadrons with simple instructions. All aircraft with torpedoes remaining would attack the port side only. No exceptions. The starboard side would be left to the dive bombers. This coordinated approach, attacking a wounded ship's vulnerable side with overwhelming force, would prove devastatingly effective. Between 12:30 and 1 o'clock that afternoon, at least 8 more torpedoes struck Yamato's port side. Each explosion tore open hull plating, flooded compartments, and added thousands of tons of water to the side that was already low in the water. The battleship's damage control teams fought heroically, shoring up bulkheads, closing watertight doors, and trying to counterflood starboard compartments to correct the list. But the damage was coming too fast and too concentrated. Aviation Machinist's Mate First Class Donald Bruns from Torpedo Squadron 9 off the carrier Yorktown made what would be one of the final successful torpedo attacks. He came in from directly astern at 40 feet, so low that his radioman later swore he could see fish in the water beneath them. The anti-aircraft fire was sporadic now, many of the guns on the port side unable to maintain power as electrical systems flooded or their crews abandoned their stations as the list worsened. Bruns released at 100 yards. His torpedo struck the port quarter, the explosion visible, from 10 miles away as a massive column of water and debris shot into the air. More critically, the hit destroyed one of Yamato's remaining watertight bulkheads, allowing flooding to spread into previously undamaged compartments. By 1:15 that afternoon, Yamato's list had reached 15 degrees to port. This doesn't sound like much, but on a ship of her size, a 15-degree list meant her portside deck edge was already at water level. Waves were washing across her main deck. Men stationed on the port side had to climb uphill to reach the center line. Vice Admiral Ito, watching from the bridge as his flagship slowly died beneath him, made the decision to ensure that his crew would have a chance to survive. At 1:20, he ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. He himself would remain aboard. Captain Kosaku Aruga, Yamato's commanding officer, also refused to leave. Both men understood that tradition demanded they go down with their ship. The crew's evacuation was hampered by the increasing list. The starboard side lifeboats were now too high above the water to launch effectively. Men had to jump from the port side directly into the ocean, or slide down the increasingly steep deck into the water. The destroyers, Fuyuzuki and Suzutsuki, maneuvered as close as they dared, pulling survivors from the water even as American aircraft continued their attacks. At 1:37, Yamato's list reached 20 degrees. This was the critical angle. The water that had been flooding her port-side compartments now began to flow over interior bulkheads, spreading to previously undamaged spaces. The flooding became irreversible. No amount of pumping or counter-flooding could save her now. The battleship's main battery turrets, each weighing over 2,500 tons, were designed to rotate on massive bearing rings. As the ship's list increased, those turrets began to shift. The port-side turret housings, already stressed by the increasing angle, started to give way. At 1:38, the forward turret housing failed. The entire turret assembly, 3 18-inch guns and 2,500 tons of steel, broke free from its mounting and slid down the sloping deck toward the port side. The movement of that much weight, combined with the water already flooding the port side, pushed Yamato past the point of no return. Her list accelerated from 20 degrees to 30 degrees in less than a minute. Men still on deck lost their footing and slid across the steel plates into the water. Equipment tore loose from its mountings. Everything not welded down became a deadly projectile sliding toward the port rail. At 1:39, the list reached 45 degrees. Yamato was now effectively on her side, her massive hull rolling over like a dying whale. The starboard side, which had been high above the water, was now exposed completely, her massive propellers and rudder visible as she capsized. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, a fighter pilot from the carrier Yorktown, circling above the scene, watched in horrified fascination. He later described seeing men in white uniforms, hundreds of them, sliding down the ship's side into the water, their forms tiny against the enormous expanse of red anti-fouling paint on Yamato's bottom as it rolled into view. At precisely 1:43 in the afternoon, as Yamato's list passed 90 degrees and she rolled completely inverted, her forward magazines exploded. The blast was cataclysmic. 4,000 tons of explosives, shells for her main battery, powder charges, and secondary ammunition, all detonated simultaneously in a fireball that rose 6,000 feet into the air. The explosion was visible from over 100 miles away. Pilots from American carriers that had already recovered their aircraft and were steaming away from the battle reported seeing the mushroom cloud on the horizon. The shock wave from the blast was felt by surface ships 30 miles distant. The Saab sound was heard in Kagoshima, over 150 miles away on the Japanese mainland. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. Where the largest battleship ever built had been struggling moments before, there was now only burning debris and oil spreading across the water. The explosion had broken the ship into 3 main sections, all of which sank immediately. The depth at this location was over 1,300 feet, deep enough that the wreckage would plunge into darkness and vanish from human sight for over 40 years. Of the 2,700 men aboard Yamato when she sailed from Japan, only 276 survived. Vice Admiral Ito went down with his flagship, last seen standing on the bridge as the ship capsized. Captain Aruga also perished, as did most of the senior officers who had chosen to remain aboard. The survivors were pulled from the water by the escorting destroyers, many suffering from burns, injuries, and shock. The American losses in the attack were remarkably light, considering the intensity of the battle. 10 aircraft were shot down, 3 fighters, 3 dive bombers, and 4 torpedo bombers. 12 aircrew were killed. Several more aircraft were damaged but made it back to their carriers. Against the loss of the world's largest battleship, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, the exchange ratio was overwhelmingly in America's favor. For Jack Lawler, the flight back to Wasp was the longest hour of his life. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the attack was wearing off, replaced by shaking hands and the sudden realization of just how close he had come to dying. The holes in his Avenger's wings and fuselage were evidence of how many rounds had come within feet, inches, of killing him and his crew. When he landed aboard Wasp and climbed down from his cockpit, his squadron commander was waiting. McBroom looked at the damage to Lawler's aircraft, looked at the young pilot, and said simply, "How low did you actually go?" Lawler's answer was honest. 50 feet, sir. Maybe lower on the final approach." McBroom was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "But good hit." The debriefing that followed would reveal that at least 12 torpedoes had struck Yamato during the 2-hour battle, possibly more. The exact number would never be known with certainty because multiple aircraft attacked simultaneously, and determining which explosions corresponded to which torpedo was impossible in the chaos of combat. But intelligence officers analyzing gun camera footage and pilot reports concluded that the attacks from below 50 feet had achieved hit rates exceeding 70%. This was extraordinary. Normal torpedo attack doctrine assumed that 20 to 30% of torpedoes launched would hit their targets under ideal conditions. Against a maneuvering capital ship with heavy anti-aircraft defenses, the expected hit rate dropped to 10% or less. But the ultra-low altitude attacks, getting close enough that the target had no time to evade, had tripled or quadrupled the effectiveness of the weapon. The cost was measured in courage and risk rather than casualties. Of the approximately 35 torpedo bombers that attempted attacks below 100 feet, 4 were shot down and 8 more were damaged. An 11% loss rate was significant, but far below the catastrophic losses suffered by torpedo bombers earlier in the war when attacking from conventional altitudes. The tactical lessons learned from Yamato's sinking were immediately incorporated into U.S. Navy doctrine. Fleet carriers received updated attack procedures, emphasizing ultra-low altitude approaches for torpedo bombers when attacking heavily defended capital ships. Pilots were trained specifically in the technique of staying below 50 feet, using the ocean's surface as concealment, and getting inside the minimum depression angle of enemy heavy anti-aircraft guns. Psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was profound and demoralizing. Yamato had been more than just a warship. She had been a symbol of Japanese naval power, the ultimate expression of battleship design, unsinkable in the minds of many Japanese sailors. Her destruction by aircraft, without ever firing her main battery in anger, demonstrated that the era of the battleship was definitively over. The carrier had proven itself the dominant capital ship of modern naval warfare. Aircraft could strike at ranges of hundreds of miles, could attack from multiple directions simultaneously, and could deliver weapons that no amount of armor could withstand. Battleships, for all their impressive guns and thick steel, were simply targets for carrier aviation. For the American carriers that had launched the strike, the victory was bittersweet. The professionalism and courage of Yamato's crew had been evident throughout the battle. They had fought to the end, manning their guns even as their ship rolled over beneath them. The massive loss of life, over 2,000 men killed in a matter of minutes, was sobering even for pilots who had spent years fighting the Japanese. Lieutenant Commander Robert McBroom, writing his after-action report that evening, noted that the torpedo attacks from extreme low altitude had proven devastatingly effective, but required a level of skill and courage that not every pilot possessed. He recommended that future training emphasize low-altitude flying techniques and that only the most experienced pilots attempt attacks below 50 feet. The technique developed that day, flying at wave-top height to get inside the defensive envelope of enemy ships, would be used for the remainder of the war. In the final months of the Pacific War, American torpedo bombers sank or damaged dozens of Japanese warships using variations of the ultra-low approach. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already crippled by losses at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf, found its remaining surface fleet hunted to near extinction by carrier aircraft that could strike with impunity. Jack Lawler flew 23 more combat missions before the war ended in August 1945. He survived them all, though his luck nearly ran out twice more. once over Tokyo Bay when his aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and he had to ditch in the water, spending 4 hours in a life raft before being rescued by a submarine. And once, when returning to his carrier in bad weather, he ran out of fuel and had to make a dead-stick landing on the deck with no engine power. After the war, Lawler rarely spoke about his experiences. Like many combat veterans, he found it difficult to convey to civilians what it had been like to fly at 50 feet above the ocean's surface with a battleship shooting at him. The intensity of those moments, the absolute focus required to keep the aircraft under control while simultaneously aiming a torpedo and evading defensive fire, was something that could only be understood by others who had been there. In 1946, Lawler received the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor, for his attack on Yamato. The citation praised his extraordinary courage and skill in pressing home an attack at extreme low altitude against the most heavily defended warship afloat. Lawler accepted the medal but insisted that every pilot who had attacked Yamato that day deserved the same recognition. They had all faced the same guns, the same odds, the same very real possibility of dying in the next few seconds. The mathematical analysis of the battle, conducted by Navy operational analysts after the war, revealed fascinating insights into the effectiveness of different attack methods. High-altitude bombing from 10,000 feet achieved approximately a 4% hit rate against Yamato. Medium-altitude bombing from 5,000 feet achieved roughly 7%. Dive bombing from near-vertical dives achieved approximately 12%, but torpedo attacks from below 50 feet achieved over 70% hit rates. The difference was attributable to multiple factors. Reduced range meant targets had less time to maneuver. The ultra-low altitude put attacking aircraft below the firing arc of the heaviest anti-aircraft weapons. And the psychological impact of aircraft roaring overhead at masthead height disrupted defensive fire coordination. The technique required extraordinary skill. Flying at 50 feet above open ocean in combat conditions, with a heavy torpedo creating drag and affecting aircraft handling, demanded perfect control inputs and absolute situational awareness. A moment's inattention, a gust of wind, a wave higher than expected, any of these could send an aircraft into the water at a speed that guaranteed instant death for the crew. Training for ultra-low altitude attacks became a specialized curriculum at naval air stations in the United States. Pilots spent hundreds of hours practicing low-altitude flight over water, learning to judge their height above the surface by instinct rather than instruments. They practiced releasing dummy torpedoes at decreasing altitudes and ranges until they could consistently hit targets from inside 500 yards while flying at 50 feet. The technique also required modifications to the Mark 13 torpedo itself. Engineers adjusted the weapon's entry parameters so it could be dropped from lower altitudes and at slower speeds without diving too deep or breaking apart on impact. By late 1945, the Mark 13 had been refined to the point where it could be released from as low as 30 feet at speeds as low as 150 miles per hour and still run reliably. The tactical doctrine that emerged emphasized the importance of coordination between different attack groups. Fighters would strafe anti-aircraft positions immediately before the torpedo attack, suppressing defensive fire during the critical seconds when bombers were at their most vulnerable. Dive bombers would attack from high altitude simultaneously, dividing the defender's attention, and torpedo bombers would come in from multiple directions at wave-top height, overwhelming the ability of enemy crews to respond effectively. This coordinated attack profile, perfected against Yamato, became the standard method for attacking Japanese warships for the remainder of the Pacific War. It was used successfully against the battleship Haruna at Kure Harbor in July 1945, against the carrier Amagi, also at Kure, against dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels that found themselves on the receiving end of American carrier strikes in the war's final months. The Japanese had no effective counter to this tactic. Their anti-aircraft guns, designed primarily for high and medium-altitude threats, couldn't depress low enough to engage wave-top attackers effectively. Their radar, primitive compared to American systems, often couldn't detect aircraft flying at extremely low altitudes due to sea clutter returns, and their combat air patrol fighters, depleted by years of attrition and increasingly short of fuel, were rarely able to intercept the heavily escorted American strikes before they reached their targets. By August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Most of its surviving warships were damaged or sunk at anchor, victims of repeated American carrier strikes. The techniques pioneered by pilots like Jack Lawler, flying at altitudes that doctrine had considered suicidal, had proven devastatingly effective against even the most heavily armored targets. The human cost of the battle deserves remembrance beyond statistics. The 2,700 men aboard Yamato who chose to sail, knowing they would almost certainly die, demonstrated a form of courage that transcends politics or national allegiance. They fought with professionalism and determination, even as their ship was systematically destroyed around them. Many stayed at their posts until the ship capsized, still firing their guns, still trying to defend their vessel against impossible odds. The American aircrew who attacked Yamato also demonstrated extraordinary courage. Flying at 50 feet above the ocean surface toward a battleship equipped with over 150 anti-aircraft guns required a special kind of bravery. It wasn't the reckless courage of youth, but the calculated courage of professionals who understood the risks and accepted them because the mission required it. The 12 American aircrew who died in the attack gave their lives in what would be one of the final major naval engagements of World War II. Their names deserve to be remembered. Lieutenant Junior Grade Theodore Hansen, shot down during his torpedo run. Ensign Richard Barber, whose Avenger exploded after taking a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. Aviation Radioman 2nd, Class James Thornton, killed when his damaged aircraft crashed while attempting to return to his carrier. These men and their comrades who died that day represented the culmination of 4 years of brutal warfare in the Pacific. They were the survivors of earlier battles, the ones who had learned their craft in combat and lived long enough to perfect it. Their skill and courage in the skies above the East China Sea on April 7, 1945, helped ensure that the war would end months later rather than dragging on for years. The wreck of Yamato remained undiscovered until 1985, when a joint Japanese-American expedition using deep-sea survey equipment located the battleship's remains in over 1,300 feet of water. The wreckage is broken into 3 main sections, testament to the violence of her final explosion. Her massive gun turrets, torn from their mountings, lie scattered across the seafloor. The site has been designated a war grave, and diving is prohibited without special permission. Photographs and video of the wreck reveal the extent of damage inflicted by the American attack. Multiple torpedo holes are visible in her hull, some large enough to drive a truck through. Her superstructure is crushed and collapsed. The graceful lines of her hull are twisted and broken. Yet even in death, even scattered across the ocean floor, Yamato retains a certain dignity, a monument to the men who built her, sailed her, and died aboard her. For the veterans who survived the attack, both American and Japanese, the memories remained vivid for the rest of their lives. Jack Lawler, interviewed in 1993 for a documentary about the Pacific War, described his 50-foot attack run on Yamato as the most intense experience of his life. He could still remember the feeling of his aircraft shuddering from near misses, the sight of the battleship's hull filling his entire field of vision, the desperate pull on the control column to climb away after releasing his torpedo. Japanese survivors of Yamato spoke of their helplessness as they watched their mighty ship slowly capsize and then explode. Many carried guilt for surviving when so many of their comrades died. Some attended annual memorial services at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, honoring the spirits of those who went down with the ship. The survivors formed an association to preserve the memory of Yamato and ensure that future generations would understand the sacrifice of her crew. The tactical legacy of the battle extends beyond World War II into modern naval warfare. The principle that ultra-low altitude attacks can defeat ship defenses by getting inside the minimum firing arc of weapons systems remains valid. Modern anti-ship missiles like the American Harpoon and the French Exocet are designed to make their final attack runs at altitudes of 10 to 30 feet, using the same logic that Jack Lawler employed in 1945. The difference is that modern missiles are unmanned and guided by computers, eliminating the need for human pilots to risk their lives at wave-top height. But the fundamental tactic, approaching a target at extreme low altitude to evade defensive fire and minimize reaction time, remains unchanged from the principles validated against Yamato. The battle also demonstrated the importance of concentrating attacks on a single vulnerable point rather than dispersing effort across multiple targets. Commander Bakutis's decision to focus all torpedo attacks on Yamato's port side, where she was already listing and taking water, accelerated her sinking by hours, if not days. This principle of concentration of force remains fundamental to military doctrine across all domains of warfare. For students of military history, the sinking of Yamato represents a clear case study in how technological and tactical innovation can overcome seemingly insurmountable defenses. Yamato was designed to be unsinkable, equipped with armor that could withstand the heaviest shells from enemy battleships. Her designers had considered threats from aircraft and equipped her with extensive anti-aircraft armament. Yet she was destroyed by attackers she couldn't effectively engage because they approached from angles and altitudes her weapons couldn't cover. The lesson is that no defensive system is perfect. Every defense has vulnerabilities, and attackers who can identify and exploit those vulnerabilities will succeed even against overwhelming defensive firepower. Yamato's vulnerability was her inability to defend against coordinated attacks from multiple altitudes simultaneously, particularly against torpedo bombers attacking from below the firing arc of her heavy guns. The April 7, 1945 attack on Yamato also marked the end of an era in naval warfare. For centuries, battleships had been the ultimate symbol of naval power, the heaviest armed and armored vessels afloat. Nations measured their naval strength by counting battleships. Naval strategy was built around battleship tactics and doctrine. The climactic battle that every navy prepared for was the decisive battleship engagement, where two fleets of heavy warships would pound each other with main battery fire until one side was destroyed or retreated. That era ended in the skies above the East China Sea, when Yamato, the ultimate expression of battleship design, was destroyed by aircraft without ever firing her main guns at an enemy ship. The carrier had definitively proven itself the dominant capital ship of modern naval warfare. Every navy in the world learned this lesson, and the post-war period saw battleships rapidly retired and replaced by carriers as the centerpiece of naval power. The courage required to fly at 50 feet above the ocean toward a battleship shooting back with over 150 guns cannot be adequately conveyed in words. It requires an understanding of how small an aircraft is compared to a battleship, how fragile aluminum skin is compared to armor-piercing shells, how little margin for error exists when flying that low at high speed. Every pilot who made that attack knew there was a very real chance they wouldn't survive the next 2 minutes. They flew anyway. They flew because the mission required it, because their training had prepared them for it, because their comrades were counting on them, and because stopping Yamato before she reached Okinawa was worth the risk. That willingness to accept mortal danger for a strategic objective is what separates professional military forces from armed mobs. It's what enabled the United States to project power across 8,000 miles of ocean and defeat an enemy that had seemed invincible just 4 years earlier. Jack Lawler lived to be 82 years old, passing away in 2004. He attended several reunions with other veterans of the Yamato attack, comparing notes and sharing stories that only they could fully appreciate. He also participated in veterans' exchanges with Japanese survivors, meetings that were initially awkward but eventually evolved into mutual respect between former enemies who recognized courage when they saw it. In his final interview before his death, Lawler was asked whether he would do it again, whether knowing what he knew, he would still fly at 50 feet toward a battleship. His answer was characteristic of his generation. "We did what we had to do. That's all there was to it." The simplicity of that statement belies the complexity of what it meant. Doing what had to be done required years of training to develop the skill. It required overcoming fear, not eliminating it but functioning despite it. It required trust in your aircraft, your weapons, your crew, and your comrades. And it required a willingness to risk everything on the bet that skill and courage and a little bit of luck would be enough. On April 7th, 1945, for Jack Lawler and dozens of other torpedo bomber pilots, that bet paid off. Yamato sank, taking with her the last vestige of the battleship era. The pilots who put her on the bottom of the East China Sea proved that courage and innovation could overcome any defense, no matter how formidable it appeared. The forbidden tactic of ultra-low altitude attack became standard doctrine, the suicidal approach became routine, and the impossible mission became a template for victory that would influence naval aviation tactics for generations to come. 72,000 tons of the finest steel Japan could produce, armed with the most powerful naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, protected by armor designed to withstand any attack, destroyed by men flying fabric and aluminum aircraft who were willing to press their attacks from 50 feet above the waves. That's the real story, not the technology or the tactics or the statistics. The story is human courage, manifested in a willingness to fly into hell because the mission required it and because someone had to do it. Jack Lawler and his generation did it, and the world they saved would never forget the price they paid for victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.